Coming up next on Headline Humboldt, a strike may well be brewing at CSU campuses up and down the state as negotiations between the state university system and its faculty appear to break down. Also, local author Judith Surber of the Hoopa tribe joins us to talk about her life, her work, and her highly acclaimed book, Reservation High, which itself is about the challenges communities and families face in their struggle with substance abuse. Coming up now on Headline Humboldt. From the top of Humboldt Hill, this is Headline Humboldt. I'm James Falk. Thanks for joining us. There's a little synchronicity there with the music. These past decades in American life have demonstrated the power and pain that arises with chemical addiction, and how those challenges can chew up an individual human life and destroy it. I know because I've lived it. It's easier than most people think. An injury suffered on the softball field or stepping off a curb, slamming your finger in a car door, can result in an exposure to an extremely hazardous material. Those hazardous materials are the very things society offers in those moments to help us feel better. Narcotic painkillers, usually derived from the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, and they have gone from being an opportunity for relief in the face of agonizing pain to becoming the source of that very agony. I broke my leg, sheared off the top of my tibia, in a catastrophic break that required 6 hours of meticulous surgery to remove the remnants. While I had taken painkillers previously for dental work, it was the prolonged exposure following bone surgery that put me in the thrall of chemical dependency. But as addiction numbers have skyrocketed and lives have been destroyed, we've also seen that with good moral and physical support, recovery is possible. But to realize that recovery on an individual or even community level, we have to realize that substance use disorder is not a death sentence, that people can recover, and when they do, it's a better world for all of us. Our guest today, Hoopa writer Judith Surber, knows the story of substance abuse, of trauma and pain, and of survival. And frankly, it's to folks like her that the rest of us, those millions of families and survivors who have only now begun to emerge from that struggle themselves, we have to turn to them in order to realize true healing. This is an important conversation about a life or death issue facing every single person in this community and in this country. Judith Surber is probably the perfect person to help lead that dialogue, at least in Humboldt County. But first, the news. Pacific gas and electric bills jumped by about $34.50 each month for average households starting on January 1st. The hike joins other increases from earlier in 2023, which together could see bills increase by more than $400 annually from 2022 levels. Additional smaller increases are scheduled for the next 2 years as well. Both the California Public Utilities Commission and PG&E executives have said the increases are needed to pay for the updating of aging infrastructure and to reduce the risk of wildfires. Utility rates in California are already among the highest in the country prior to the rate jump. Mark Toney, executive director of ratepayer advocate nonprofit, the Utility Reform Network, told the San Francisco Chronicle his organization is pushing the state to establish a cap on rate increases and said a lack of limits on utility bills is hurting Californians. Quote, "We are in an affordability crisis, the likes of which we've never seen before," Toney said. "These increases are just unprecedented." In the face of a breakdown in negotiations between the California Faculty Association and the California State University system, the union has called for a general work stoppage on CSU campuses just as the new semester is set to begin. Decrying the CFA's lack of movement from its initial proposal over a period of 7 months, the university system offered a band-aid. Quote, "Given these circumstances, we have taken action to provide all bargaining unit employees represented by a CFA, which includes faculty, coaches, counselors, and librarians, with well-deserved raises in the form of a general salary increase of 5% effective January 31st, along with other terms including increasing department chairperson pay and allowing for modest increases to parking fees." The union predictably rejected that offer and made plans for a strike. Quote, "Today, in lieu of real proposals, management walked away from the table after just a few minutes," said Charlie Toombs, CFA president. Quote, "We'd rather than bargain in good faith with the union, they expressed nothing but disdain for faculty. We know they have the money in their flush reserve accounts." The strike is scheduled for January 22nd to January 26th, according to press releases from the CFA. Quote, "The system-wide strike on all 23 campuses over January 22nd to January 26th will demonstrate to Chancellor Mildred Garcia that she must do right by the faculty, staff, and students of the CSU. Joining us now is writer Judith Surber, a Hoopa tribal member, and I'm thrilled to death to have you here to talk. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So just to give people a little bit of a sense of your recent history, you have the book Reservation High, which has been highly acclaimed, and recently together with Justin Maxson, who I've had on the show before, a great guy. You guys collaborated on a piece for the New York Times called Addiction Ravaged My Family and Tribe. I'm Fighting to Get That Back. And that story was selected by the Pulitzer Center as one of the best stories of the year, which is about as high as the praise can get.
Right. It's been really exciting, James. Justin and I have worked together on other things. I met him when he came and did a Washington Post story on palliative care, and we had a reporter and him shadow me and my husband for several days. And he's really into addiction. He is also recovering. And so this piece was in the work for about a year.
Beautifully done.
We never thought it would get that high. You know, we were pitching it and then it was accepted. And I didn't know how honestly life-changing it was going to be to have an article in the New York Times. And then to have it picked by the Pulitzer Foundation was like a icing on the cake at that point. So
I bet. I mean, I can only imagine what my own feelings being a writer would be to have that kind of acclaim. But you deserve it. The work is beautiful. The photographs and the story that you write in the New York Times is beautifully done. If you're watching this show on YouTube, there'll be a link in the description to go there. There may be a paywall, but it's worth the few bucks you may have to pay to check out that story. And then, of course, her book. For those people who know my story, I find a lot to love about Judith Surber's work. She basically tells a personal story about addiction through her fiction in the book and through her own life in the article. Can you talk to us a little bit about what made you approach this project and why you think it's so important that we change how we're all thinking about the addiction issue, both in greater society and then on the reservation?
So when I wrote Reservation High, I actually started it in 2014. And at that time, heroin was at the height of everything. If I wrote it now, I would substitute the word heroin for fentanyl because fentanyl is kind of taken over. And I say that fentanyl makes heroin look like a cakewalk at this point. But when I started writing the book, it was a really hard time in my life personally. I've never done drugs in my life except for, like, I smoked weed as a teenager. But in my adult life, everybody that I loved the most had really severe addiction problems. And like you said, addiction can come to people so many different ways. Like, nobody is exempt. And so in my family, my husband, who was a wonderful man, I loved him dearly. He worked in the woods as a logger for over 20 years. He was a hard worker. He took really good care of me and our children. And he got hurt in the woods. And the first thing the doctors did was put him on pain pills. And those quickly got to be more and more until one day, all of a sudden, people said, these are bad and we're not going to give them to you anymore.
Exactly.
And at that point, so many people then went to find something else. Like, there wasn't MAT services, medication being offered. And people did what they had to do. Like, people were not going to just cold turkey and suffer. A lot of people could medically never make it through that. He was sick at that point with severe COPD, and I lost him in 2019.
I'm sorry for that.
But also, two of my sons had severe addiction, and what started off, they were young, recreational, using a few Norcos, then the Oxycontin were introduced, and I remember a lot of their friends buying them, and they would split a pill, and one pill could be $60 for one little green pill, and but that quickly turned into severe addiction. And when those were no longer available, and also heroin became more available, cheaper, everybody just kind of rolled over to that.
Yeah,
And I love
I
my
was one of them.
children. Yeah, I loved my family and I stood by them. But it was a very lonely time for me personally.
I
I
bet.
had a
Yeah.
hard job. I had a political appointment here as the executive secretary of the Hoopa tribe. And people, I just felt like I lost people. They would say, "Oh, Judy must like it. She doesn't leave," or "Judy must like it. She doesn't kick them out," or the stigma and the judgment that comes down on the family is really harsh. And even today, I get beat up over it a lot in my own community, and it hurts and it's hard. And it was just a really hard time in my life. So I started writing the book, and I always was a writer, and I was a grant writer. I did fiction and creative, but I never had finished an actual novel. And so I started writing it, and I just threw myself into it. And I got about halfway through, and my son was one of the men that was shot in the head at Redwood Grove in 2015, and the chest. And um, he's alive, and he survived, but it was a really hard year for us trauma wise. And a month later, my youngest and only daughter was stabbed in a DV incident 3 times. So I had had these severe traumas back to back. They were pretty much drug related. And at that point, I decided I was going to finish this book if it was the last thing I did. And so I just sunk myself into it. I wanted to make the characters likable. I wanted people to have empathy. I wanted them to see that these weren't bad people. They were lost and they needed help, and there was help for them. But I wanted people to see that people do get lost and they can get out. And so that's what prompted this book.
Yeah. There's two different approaches there because you have the book, which is fiction, but then you have the story in the New York Times, which is factual. It's basically reporting. I'm wondering about when you were writing the book, how did you draw that line between fiction and reality? Like what details to use, and were there? I mean, were
So
there?
I didn't
Yeah.
I didn't want to use my family story,
Right.
but there's so many things that roll over an addiction for every family. There's
Absolutely.
similarities. And so I've had so many people come up and say, "I feel like you told my story. How did you know this happened to me?" Or a lot of the characters they think is after somebody, but they're actually, I have a really good imagination, and they're actually a combination of just a lot of people and a lot of personalities.
Yeah.
They were fiction people, and but there are just so many similarities of how it happens, or what the feelings are the fallout to the mom. There's the mom who's trying so hard, but people look down on her. That was a lot based on how I felt.
Sure.
The children who, all of a sudden doesn't have their mother. And so it's just a lot of compilation of a lot of things, but no particular story. At that time, I just didn't honestly feel secure enough to tell my story. And it felt too personal. And I didn't feel brave enough, I guess. But when we started doing the article, the day it came out in the New York Times, I cringed all day. I was just waiting for like to really get bashed. I was expecting my phone to go off. And with a lot of really negative stuff, I started feeling sick that day, thinking, "Oh my gosh, like what have I done to myself?" But I can honestly say I have gotten hundreds of emails and calls and texts from all over the world, and they have all been so positive. And I really haven't got much negative. I have just had such supportive ones from a lady in Greece, and a man in France, and my indigenous sisters in Canada, and people who work in the mat field and recovering people. One man wrote and said, I had somebody in the world who loved me like you love your kids, and I'm only here today because of that.
Oh
Keep
my
doing
goodness.
what you're doing. And so, surprisingly, I guess for me, I've had just really positive, nice things come out of the story.
It's interesting. In my own post-addiction career, we had produced a documentary here called Addicts Among Us, and my wife was in it. She's been my partner through all of my issues, ups and downs, and she left me for a while, but then we got back together. We have 4 kids, and her part of the documentary, I mean, ostensibly it was about my issue and my recovery and the broader issue of heroin addiction. But the story that shone through in the documentary, and I think is true in your case as well, is that the real complex character, the pivotal person in these relationships, and whether or not people can succeed or not, is often the loved ones, whether it's a mother or a father or a brother or a sister. It's a person who continues to have that person's interests at heart and is rooting for them in spite of all the bad things that may be going on or the crimes that may be committed. There's still this selfless love thing going on. And for myself, that's what made my recovery possible. And I think that more people need to realize the value of that rather than shame or rejection or all the things that people do when they don't know what to do to save a loved one who's lost to this disease. The disengaging and the tough love thing, from my experience, doesn't work. It just further isolates people. They don't have a safe place where they can land, and so they're more at risk than they would be otherwise. And so anyway, I mean, there's just a commonality there between, it's like, you guys are the ones, I'm almost talking to my wife here, who end up rescuing that family and providing some sort of safe space for people to emerge into. And I think that you need to be commended for telling that story and also for living that life. So I appreciate you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
I do think that, I can't say tough love doesn't work for maybe some people.
Sure.
But
that's
I
always the
tried
case.
it before with my family. It didn't work.
Yeah.
And I haven't really seen it work often. I mean, the only times my kids have done better is when I just love them unconditionally through it. And I think people don't realize that you can love your children and support them without supporting the addiction.
Yeah.
I have a son living on the street in Santa Rosa, and I set up an account. I'll order him a hamburger at Burger King that he can pick up, or, I get him a sleeping bag because, I hate how he's living and I worry every minute of the day, especially at night. But, I'm
Yeah.
there for him. I love him regardless. And he knows that. He
Yeah.
knows that he can come, and I have open arms at any time for him.
And it's easy for me to say, tough love doesn't work. I mean, obviously, in these relationships, you have to set boundaries because they're going to keep coming to you. And you can get exhausted emotionally and financially and everything else trying to help them. I mean, and, hearing about your story and reading that things started getting missing from your house, I stole from my own mother. And I had to go back years later and have that conversation. And, I mean, I'm just thankful that I had the opportunity to make that change, and I hope other people get there as well. But to do that, it seems like there's an ongoing issue in our community and elsewhere where the stigma hasn't quite thoroughly dissipated yet. It's a disease. I mean, so that's a model of treatment that implies that there might be medical interventions that we can do that can help people survive and thrive long enough to actually make the permanent break off of chemicals. And you happen to run a clinic in that regard, am I right?
Right. So I'm the manager of the MAT program here in Hoopa. I think one misconception people have is that Suboxone or even methadone are temporary, that some people, I've heard even professionals say that it should just be short term, but a lot of us in the field do not believe that. I say it's like diabetes. Some people
Absolutely.
exercise, they change their diet, and they don't have to have insulin or medications anymore. And some people, no matter what, have to have medication the rest of their life. So it's a case by case basis. Some people successfully get off Suboxone eventually, and some people probably never will. But they're having a life, they're working, they're taking care of their family. They're not stealing, they're not committing crimes anymore. So I think you're right that we have to look at it as the medical disease that it is
Yeah.
and take that stigma away. I also think we need to take the stigma away from relapse. Like, people
Sure.
do relapse. It
It's
happens.
part of
I
the
have it
process
in
of
my
recovery.
book.
Yes.
It is. And I notice with the old school thinking is, they count their days, and I've been clean 60 days and I've been clean 2 years, and then they have a relapse and they have to start over. And that's really hard for a lot of people to come to terms with.
Yeah.
But to me, those days never went anywhere. You still have them. And I think if we would take that stigma away, people would come and get right back on the wagon sooner and work again towards recovery, instead of feeling this shame that they have to carry then with them for relapsing, which we know happens and is very normal in recovery periods.
Yeah, and that, I mean, the shame is a lot of times what's at the source of the addiction proper. So, I mean, anything that we do to add on to shame that people may be feeling naturally about whatever else is going on in their life doesn't help. One of the things that you
Right.
mentioned earlier was trauma. And I know from the documentary that we made in my own life that I think trauma led me to abuse drugs. At least it helped me to mask emotional, pain when I discovered them, and so that's what I used them for, which I think led to the addiction. And it seems like trauma is one of the engines of what cause addiction rates to go up. Humboldt County has a really high rates of adolescent trauma, and as a result, that breeds more addicts, which turn into parents who can sometimes cause trauma to their own kids, and it becomes this self-feeding cycle. And I know that, I mean, for a Native American tribe where historic trauma is looming in the past for the last 150 years, and we're talking, desperate conditions a lot of the time. Can you talk a little bit about how that, that bigger trauma creates a special challenge?
Well, first, I'd like to say that, my second book, which will be out in February, is about trauma.
Okay.
So it's called The Broken Ones.
Mm-hmm.
And with the article in the New York Times, I've now signed a 2-book deal with the Riverdale Avenue Publishing Company in New York.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's
So
amazing.
they're going to do a reprint on Reservation High with a new cover. They're going to market it and get it out for me, and have some quotes from places. And then the next book will be out, I believe they said, the end of February. So it isn't about his addiction as much as it's about trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And people who kind of some mental health things and the trauma that goes on in Native country. Because I do believe that trauma is the base of a lot of the addiction. I do believe it's hard. There's people who don't believe in generational trauma. But when you look at Humboldt County and like specifically Hoopa, we didn't even have contact here until like 1960s. I mean, 1860s. So we haven't had that long, like some of the tribes back east who had contact in the 1600s and the 1500s. Ours was very late compared to the other tribes. And so the trauma is a lot more recent. And I feel like the historical trauma, we have a lot of tragedy here, a lot of deaths. I mean, there's weeks we go by with 3 funerals a week. In the last year, we've had 15 plus fatal overdoses. We've had some really tragic wrecks. And so we have a lot of tragedy. We've had a lot of loss. And then you mix the historical, and then you mix the poverty. We have the highest number of children in foster care. I mean, there's just so many things that play into addiction. And I really feel like we have to work hard to elevate each person and each family, meeting their needs, making sure people have housing and food. And I mean, that's a lot of the battle. And even kindness, like when We do a lot of outreach at my program. We believe in harm reduction and meeting people where they are.
Absolutely.
And we go out. I have a great crew here who goes out every day on the street. And I say, even if people aren't ready for treatment yet, just be really kind to them because everybody needs that kindness. Everybody's not in a good place. And when they do want to get help or treatment, they'll remember that and then we'll get them back that way. So trauma does play in a lot, though. That's why my second book is about the trauma.
Well, yeah, and I will look for that one as well. For people who are just discovering this in their lives, whether they have just become aware that someone in their family is addicted or they themselves might be becoming addicted or anything along those lines, what's your advice once you realize that you have this, what could become a cancer in your life? Should you not overreact? What are the first steps someone should take if they are, say, a family member and there's someone addicted that they?
I mean, the first thing I think you should do is not blame yourself. I think we tend, especially a parent, I think parents really tend to blame themselves and society blames you too. So then you look at what did I do wrong? What could I have done different? How did I, and really it's not about blaming. Like, I don't know why society feels like they always have to have somebody to blame. And if you want to blame somebody, then blame big pharma companies or something like
Yeah,
not yourself, not your neighbor, not your friend, not your relative. And then I would, just say be kind to yourself and to the person you love. Like they're not doing it on purpose. I had to learn that my kids did love me. Like I would say things like, if you loved me, you would quit. And I learned that that wasn't true. I know my sons and my kids really, really love me. And I know if they could have just quit, they would have now. But I used to feel like that, like they didn't love me because they're still, So just realize that they're not doing it to hurt you. They're not doing it to ruin your day or your life. And then I would look into treatment. There is treatment. And some people, the Suboxone works for, but not everybody. We have a lot of people who go out to methadone. And I see that now getting this big stigma too, where people are, oh, that's a drug for a drug. But I know people who couldn't have got off fentanyl if fentanyl's 50 times stronger than heroin. So how they treat the detox and recovery has to be a lot more than what we did for heroin. So if somebody needs methadone to get off the fentanyl, it's safer, it can be more effective. And I think people need to open their mind. So open your mind and look for avenues to get your child help.
That's amazing, eloquent, and your book is amazing, and the article. Thank you so much. We're out of time for the day, so thanks for coming on the show. Okay.
Thanks for having me.
Yep. Stay tuned, stay informed.